They were not like us. To the Vikings, the body was not merely flesh. It was a vessel, a weapon, and above all, an offering. While modern eyes see intimacy as private, sacred, or romantic, for the Norse pagans it could be none of those things. Desire was not a feeling. It was tribute. Ecstasy was not pleasure. It was sacrifice. And nowhere was this belief more horrifyingly embodied than inside the hidden pagan temples where sexual initiation rites were performed beneath torchlight, bone charms, and carved idols staring from the shadows. These were not temples in the modern sense. Some were grand wooden halls dedicated to gods like Freyr and Freya, patron deities of fertility. Others were nothing more than sacred groves, standing stones, or underground chambers cut into hillsides, sealed from the sun. But regardless of shape, they all followed the same rule. Once you entered, you no longer owned your body. It belonged to the gods. And through the gods, it belonged to whoever presided over the ritual. Not everyone was invited. Some came willingly, desperate to be accepted into warrior cults or priesthood circles. Others came because they were chosen. Young women selected as brides for the fertility rites, thralls taken as temple property, or boys on the brink of manhood forced to endure whatever was demanded of them to prove their worth. If a person refused, it was not seen as disobedience. It was seen as blasphemy. To deny the gods their due was worse than cowardice in battle. It was spiritual treason. Witnesses described scenes that would blur the line between devotion and depravity. At the center of many of these rites stood a wooden idol, often carved with exaggerated anatomy, smeared with blood or oil, decorated with rings and bones from earlier sacrifices. Around it, men and women, young and old, warrior and slave, formed circles and chains of flesh, their bodies moving not in passion but in strict rhythm, guided by chants that rose like storms through the air. The sound of drums mingled with heavy breathing. The scent of sweat mixed with incense and animal fat burning on the altar. Everything was designed to strip away individuality, to dissolve pride, shame, resistance. No one was allowed to remain merely human. They had to become vessels for something divine or monstrous. Some initiations required endurance. Prospective warriors were made to enter the temple blindfolded, bound, and left to the mercy of priestesses who tested not their strength in combat, but their ability to surrender. Others demanded dominance, where men were ordered to prove their virility before witnesses to show they carried the seed strong enough to continue the tribe. Women, too, faced trials, not of submission alone, but of transformation. A girl could enter as a maiden and leave as what they called a key-bearer, a woman considered spiritually awakened, forever tied to the temple. But the awakening came at a price. She had to give herself not to a single partner, but to the ritual itself, to the god behind the ritual. The boundaries between sacred and grotesque did not exist. Bloodletting was common. Offerings did not always come in the form of coins or jewelry. Sometimes it came as cuts across the thighs during climax, mixed with tears, sweat, and chants invoking Freyr's blessing over the growing season. To the Vikings, these acts were not sinful. They were seasonal. Just as crops required plowing, so too did the human soul. Passion had to be broken like soil. Only then could life grow. But beneath the belief, beneath the tradition, there was fear. Because everyone who entered knew that such rites were not merely symbolic. They changed people. Some emerged proud, walking taller, eyes burning with a new kind of pride. Others stumbled out in silence, haunted, unable to meet the eyes of their kin. Some were never seen again, claimed by the temple, kept as living offerings. Those who spoke of what they saw did so in whispers, as if afraid the gods might hear and drag them back. Modern historians argue over how widespread these rites truly were. Some claim they were rare, exaggerated by Christian chroniclers to paint pagans as beasts. Others argue the opposite, that such rituals were so normalized that no one even bothered writing them down. But one truth remains: the Vikings believed the gods were watching. And when the gods demanded proof of devotion, they did not want words, or prayers, or promises. They wanted flesh, trembling and obedient beneath their gaze. They said it was not lust that drove them, but duty. Every initiation, Every coupling, every whispered command inside those temples was justified with one unbreakable law: life must continue. To the Vikings, fertility was not a private matter between lovers. It was a strategic necessity. A dead warrior could be replaced. A fallen chieftain could be avenged. But an empty cradle? That was a curse. A village without children was already a grave. And so, desire was weaponized. Reproduction was ritualized. Sex ceased to be personal. It became public, political, and, at times, terrifying. The origins of these rites lay deep in their mythology. They believed that before gods ruled the skies, giants ruled the flesh. Creation itself began with collision: fire and ice, male and female, struggling, merging, devouring, birthing. Their legends did not speak of purity, but of chaos. Odin, the Allfather, did not gain wisdom through prayer. He hung himself on a sacred tree for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, offering his body to himself. Freya, goddess of love, was not a figure of softness. She took lovers by choice and by bargain, even trading her body for mastery over magical treasures. Their gods taught them one lesson above all: power is taken through sacrifice, of pain, pride, or flesh. Temple officiants used these legends as foundation. Priests and priestesses did not merely recite mythology, they reenacted it using the bodies of initiates. A young man might be told he was Odin hanging on the tree, blindfolded, arms stretched, forbidden to speak while hands explored him in the dark. A woman might be adorned in gold and furs, presented as Freya, only to be stripped in front of the assembly as a symbol of her surrender to divine will. These were not plays. They were rehearsals of belief, designed to make mortals feel what the gods once endured. Only then, they said, could humans understand the world beyond vision. And yet, beneath the divine justification, there was structure. These rituals followed strict sequences, often timed with the moon cycles or agricultural seasons. Spring rites were gentle, focused on blessings and matchmaking. Autumn rites were harsher, laced with blood, performed after harvest to honor both life and death. Some gatherings allowed laughter, feasting, flirtation. Others demanded silence so absolute that even breathing felt like rebellion. Participants never knew which version awaited them until the doors closed. There were roles: chosen, assigned, or forced. The givers and receivers, though neither side held full control. A high-ranking woman could be made to kneel before a man she outranked outside the temple. A warrior who commanded armies could be made to serve a priestess whose body held no weapon but was deemed holier than steel. These reversals were intentional. They believed that true strength came from knowing both domination and submission. To live as Viking was to understand the blade, and also the exposed throat beneath it. Not all acts were equal. Some were meant to bless land or ensure pregnancy. Others were intended to bind groups together so they would fight as one in battle. A circle of warriors might be ordered into frenzied union under the watch of a blood-smeared idol, each forced to touch, bite, or grasp until all sense of brotherhood became indistinguishable from animal instinct. In those moments, individuality vanished. Shame was forbidden. Hesitation was weakness. And yet, after it was over, they stood shoulder to shoulder as if nothing had happened. No one spoke of it, but no one ever forgot. For women, the rituals could be both liberation and torment. Some saw them as holy ascension, stepping into roles of priestesses, healers, or seeresses after proving their endurance before gods and witnesses. Others experienced the same rites as violation disguised as sanctity. Whether they entered with pride or dread, they emerged changed. Even those who consented felt the weight of what had been demanded. To be chosen by the temple was an honor. It was also a sentence. Thralls, slaves taken in raids, were often used as offerings. Their bodies were not considered theirs to give. If they cried, it was seen as the spirits reacting through them. If they struggled, it was claimed that ancient forces resisted purification. Some were kept alive to be reused in future rites. Others were sacrificed at climax, throats slit in final offering to Freyr or Odin. The line between life and death blurred inside those walls. The moment of ecstasy could become the moment of execution. There were witnesses too, elders, mothers, even children at times. They believed that shielding innocence from the realities of flesh made for weak adults. Better to see the hunger of the world early than to be devoured by it later. But silence was enforced. What was seen inside the temple stayed there. Words spoken afterward were punishable. Not by law but by curse. They believed that the gods themselves struck down those who broke ritual secrecy. To speak of it openly was to invite disaster upon the whole village. Some historians argue that these accounts are exaggerated, tainted by Christian chroniclers seeking to demonize pagans. And perhaps some details are embellished. But even if these rituals were not as widespread or extreme in every settlement, one fact stands unshaken. The Vikings believed that life was bought with blood, fate was won through bravery, and pleasure, when offered to the gods, was no longer pleasure. It was tribute, and tribute was never gentle. When we study their practices, we are tempted to judge, to ask how they could do such things. But perhaps the better question is this: were they truly more brutal than us, or simply more honest? They did not hide desire behind poetry or promises. They faced it, bound it, carved it into law. In their world, the body was a weapon and an altar. And inside those pagan temples, it was both used and sacrificed with equal devotion. They called it elevation, though there was nothing heavenly about it. In many temples, the most feared part of the initiation was not the ritual of surrender, nor even the exposure before the tribe. It was the ascent. A platform stood at the center of the sacred space, raised above the ground by wooden pillars polished smooth from years of gripping hands. To reach it, initiates had to climb, not with dignity, but with trembling limbs and exposed flesh, while those below watched in silence or whispered incantations that echoed like curses. No matter how strong, how proud, how defiant one entered, the climb turned them all into animals scrambling upward with shaking breath. Some slipped. Some froze. None were allowed to turn back. At the top stood the officiant, sometimes a priest, sometimes a priestess, sometimes both. They waited like vultures, draped in furs or naked except for ritual markings carved into their skin. Their faces were often covered with masks shaped like animals, the boar for strength, the stag for virility, the mare for fertility. To the crowd below, they were no longer human. They were embodiments of gods. And to touch them was not intimacy, it was obedience to divine command. The initiate was expected to present themselves, body bowed, neck exposed, as if awaiting execution. In a sense, they were. What ascended was flesh. What descended was reborn, or broken. The act that followed was different in every temple, but its purpose was always the same: to erase the boundary between worshipper and offering. In some places, the officiant demanded the initiate lie upon a slab carved with runes, its surface cold and sticky from past rites. In others, they had to kneel on animal hides still wet from slaughter, the smell of blood filling their nostrils until arousal and revulsion became indistinguishable. Then came the touch, not gentle, never tender, but deliberate, methodical. Hands explored not in passion but in ritual inspection, as if assessing livestock. Every gasp, every tremor, every attempt to compose oneself was judged. Those who flinched were mocked. Those who remained still were tested further. The goal was not pleasure. It was transformation through humiliation. Witnesses were not bystanders. They were participants. Some were ordered to chant, others to strike drums in slow rhythm to match the rising motion of hips and breath. Some were told to speak praises aloud, praising the gods for accepting the mortal before them. A parent might be forced to watch their child ascend. A warrior might be made to witness his sworn brother submitted to flesh he could not touch. Bonds were tested. Loyalties bent. Those who looked away were struck. Those who stared too eagerly were noted for future rites. For certain initiates, particularly those destined for priesthood, the climax of the ascent was marked not by ecstasy but by blood. Sharp blades traced their thighs, shoulders, or genitals, not deep enough to cripple but deep enough to bind. The officiant would smear the blood across their lips or chest, then press their body close, mixing fluids as offering to Frere or Njord. Sometimes the officiant would bite, leaving marks like brands. The initiate was expected to respond, not with resistance, but with acceptance, eyes open, breath steady, even as pain bloomed beneath skin. It was proof of devotion, proof of worth, proof that they could endure pleasure and pain without flinching, without speaking, without losing control. But not everyone endured. Some screamed. Some begged. Some fainted mid-rite and collapsed like discarded carcasses. These were not pitied. They were ridiculed. In some temples, such failures were sent back to their homes in shame, forever marked as unworthy. In others, they were kept as permanent temple property, condemned to serve rather than ascend again. In the worst cases, they were sacrificed then and there, throat cut above the altar so their blood would drip upon those still waiting to climb, reminding them of what refusal cost. Men endured differently than women, not because they were stronger, but because their pride was shaped differently. To break a man, priestesses often used laughter. They touched him, not seductively, but mockingly, commenting on every tremor, every instinct he tried to suppress. If he hardened, they called him beast. If he softened, they called him coward. There was no winning, only surrender. Women, on the other hand, were pushed toward frenzy. They were told to embrace the goddess within them, to let go of restraint entirely. If they held back, they were forced further. If they gave fully, they were praised with tears and applause. But beneath the praise lay control. The temple decided when a woman was holy. She could never decide it for herself. Some ascents were not solitary. There were rites where pairs were sent up, strangers forced to enact union while the officiant watched, guiding them like puppets. They were not allowed to speak to each other, not allowed to kiss unless commanded, not allowed to show tenderness. It was not about connection. It was about obedience. When it was over, they were separated without a word, never told whether their performance pleased the gods or sealed their damnation. The aftermath was often worse than the act itself. The initiate, shaking and breathless, was led down slowly, step by step, their legs barely holding. The crowd parted in silence, not out of respect but out of ritual distance. No one touched them. No one spoke to them. They were expected to walk alone to a basin of cold water and wash themselves beneath the moon. Some wept. Some stared blankly. Some laughed, hysterical, unable to understand what they had become. Only after cleansing were they allowed to rejoin the living. But they were never the same. Outside the temple, they were honored or feared. Some wore their scars proudly, believing themselves chosen. Others hid them, knowing that their body now bore stories they could never tell. A few found strength in what they endured. Many found silence. The climb had been meant to elevate them. In truth, it buried something deep within. Something that would never rise again. And yet, for all the horror, people continued to volunteer. Because in a world where death came swiftly by blade or sea or winter, the greatest fear was not suffering, but insignificance. Better to be marked by the gods than forgotten by time. Better to bleed in sacred light than rot in mediocrity. And so, they climbed. Again and again. They told themselves it was sacred, that what happened inside those walls was for the gods alone. But when night fell and the torches burned low, when the chanting stopped and the idols stared in silence, another truth crept through the cracks. These rites were not only about faith. They were about power. Power of body over body. Power of will over fear. Power of the few over the many. And nowhere was that power more brutally enforced than in the rituals of ownership that followed initiation. Once an initiate had climbed, once they had bled or bowed or moaned beneath divine command, they were no longer seen as ordinary members of the tribe. They were marked, not always with scars or tokens, but with expectation. They were expected to obey, to be ready, to serve when summoned. The temple did not release its chosen entirely. It lingered within them like a shadow. Elders watched them closely, not with kindness but with calculation. Warriors who had endured the rites were used as examples. Women who had ascended were paraded at feasts, forced to smile as men toasted to their blessing. They were praised publicly, but privately they were prodded, tested to see if the submission they showed before the gods remained in the daylight. The worst of these trials came in the form of what was called the silent summons. An initiate could be approached at any time, during work, during sleep, even mid-meal, and ordered to follow a priest or priestess back to the sacred ground. They were not told why. They were not told for how long. They were expected to comply without question. Some were sent simply to clean floors slick with past offerings. Others were ordered to strip and kneel while strangers judged their willingness to be touched again. The purpose was not pleasure. It was to test whether devotion had turned to entitlement, whether humility had endured beyond ritual, whether the gods still owned them. Some resisted. Quietly at first, a tremble of the hand, a hesitation at the door, a momentary refusal to undress. These were not tolerated. The temple believed that hesitation was a disease that, if left unchecked, would rot the core of faith. Those who resisted were taken not gently but forcefully. Bound in rope or iron, they were dragged back to the platform they once climbed willingly. This time, there was no ascent. They were lifted like carcasses, stripped like animals, displayed not as offerings but as warnings. The officiants no longer spoke in chants. They spoke in cold words, reminding the crowd that even chosen flesh could become disobedient flesh. And disobedient flesh could be broken. The crowd watched. Some with pity. Some with hunger. Some with indifference. But none interfered. To question the temple was to question the gods. To rescue the fallen was to declare war on the divine. And so, the rite continued. The initiate who once walked proudly now trembled under the same touch they once accepted. But this time, there was no illusion of holiness. It was not ascension. It was correction. Women who resisted were often subjected to prolonged humiliation. They were made to stand in the center of the hall as others circled them, whispering judgments. Their hair was undone, their garments torn to shreds. Their bodies were painted in ash or mud to symbolize impurity. Then, one by one, hands reached out, not to soothe, but to seize. It was not frenzy as in earlier rites. It was methodical, controlled, designed to burn defiance out of their bones. When at last they collapsed, shaking and silent, the officiant would declare that the gods had forgiven them. Forgiveness came not through mercy, but through suffering. Men faced a different torment. They were not stripped of dignity through exposure. They were stripped through impotence. They were mocked for their strength, goaded to react, provoked to rage. If they fought, they were beaten. If they surrendered, they were bound. Some were forced to kneel for hours, aroused by hands they could not see, ordered to remain still no matter what was done to them. Failure meant being cast out as weak. Success meant being claimed as property. There was no path to freedom, only deeper binding. And yet, within this cruelty, there were those who flourished. Some found purpose in obedience. They believed that surrender cleansed them of mortal weight. They walked with serene faces, speaking softly, moving gracefully, their eyes distant as if already half in another world. These were the ones chosen later to become officiants themselves. Not the strongest, not the loudest, but the ones who had learned to erase the self entirely. They became instruments. They became priests. And thus, the cycle continued. The psychology of the temple was not random. It was engineered. Every ritual, every humiliation, every unspoken rule was designed to create hierarchy not just in the body, but in the mind. To make people believe that suffering willingly was more noble than living freely. To make them grateful for chains if those chains bore the name of gods. And worst of all, to make witnesses long, in secret, to be chosen next. Because as terrifying as these trials were, they also came with power. Those who survived became untouchable. No ordinary villager could harm them. No warrior could challenge them without risking divine wrath. Even chieftains bowed their heads when a temple-marked initiate walked by. It was a strange kind of throne, built not on victory, but on submission. But power bought with degradation is a poison. It eats slowly, quietly, without warning. Some initiates grew hollow-eyed, unable to distinguish devotion from addiction. They craved the temple even when it hurt them. They felt empty when they were not commanded. They could no longer love without ritual, no longer touch without permission. Their humanity had been replaced by duty. And in the dead of night, when even the gods were silent, they trembled, not from pain remembered, but from fear of what they had become. And yet, when the drums called again, they returned. They said that the gods spoke more clearly through women, that men could rage and conquer, but only women could hear the whispers beneath the earth. And so, for all their dominance in war, Viking men stepped aside when it came to the rights of flesh-bound prophecy. In those moments, women ruled, not with blade or shield, but with body and blood. The temple transformed when women gathered within it. The air thickened with smoke and honey, the scent of pine mingled with sweat and burning herbs. Torches dimmed. Drums slowed. There was no roaring chorus as in the rites of men. There was humming, low, trembling, almost mournful. They said it was the sound of the goddess waking beneath their feet. The highest authority among them was the vulva, the seeress. Draped in cloaks woven with silver and fur, she carried no weapon but a staff topped with animal bone. Men feared her more than any warrior. Women revered her as both mother and executioner. For she alone knew who would be chosen. Not all women could ascend in these rites. Some were deemed too proud, others too soft. The vulva walked among them, touching foreheads, lifting chins, staring deep into eyes as if reading the past and future at once. When she selected someone, she did not ask. She simply placed a wreath of dried flowers upon their head. That simple crown weighed heavier than iron. Those chosen were led into the inner chamber, away from the eyes of men. There, the rules of the world shifted. Age no longer mattered. A childless widow could stand beside a young maiden. A thrall could stand beside a chieftain's daughter. Rank dissolved. What remained was womanhood, not as softness, but as force. They formed a circle around a stone basin filled with mead, ash, and animal fat. The vulva dipped her fingers in and painted symbols upon their breasts and bellies, spirals for fertility, crosses for protection, jagged lines for sacrifice. No one knew which mark meant blessing or curse. They were not allowed to ask. Then the chanting began. Not in words, but in breath. Each inhale and exhale synchronized until the room pulsed like a single lung. The vulva commanded them to sway, hips circling slowly, hands exploring their own bodies as if awakening dormant power. This was not done for pleasure. It was done to remind them that their flesh was not passive. It was storm, soil, sea. Some began to cry without knowing why. Others trembled with rage long buried. The vulva encouraged both. Emotion was offering. But not all rites stayed gentle. When the goddess of love was invoked, Freya, she who wept golden tears, every woman was required to abandon fear entirely. Clothing was stripped away, not in shame, but in declaration. They stood naked in the flickering light, their bodies no longer private but communal. They were instructed to touch each other, not with tenderness, but with curiosity. To trace scars. To explore softness. To press forehead to forehead and breathe as one. Some hesitated. They had been taught that intimacy was something given to men. But the vulva struck the ground with her staff and declared, "How can you offer pleasure if you do not know it? How can you bear life if you do not first claim your own?" There were stories of deeper rites, whispers of nights where the vulva would lay upon a stone slab and allow herself to be possessed by Freya. Her voice would change. Her body would writhe as if struck by unseen hands. Then she would speak, not as priestess, but as goddess incarnate. Women would approach her, one by one, to be blessed through touch, lips brushing skin with reverence bordering on desperation. This was no act of desire. It was hunger for power. Some collapsed in ecstasy, trembling as if lightning had passed through them. Others remained cold, untouched by the goddess, marked as barren in spirit even if fertile in womb. But the most feared rite was not for maidens or mystics. It was for brides. Before a woman could be wed, she was often sent to the temple, not to be blessed, but to be emptied. The belief was simple: no man should inherit another man's shadow. If a woman had lain with someone before marriage, that spirit remained within her. And so, the temple performed what they called the cleansing of the womb. The bride stood upon a wooden block while priestesses circled her, chanting. She was stripped. Her thighs were spread. A carved wooden idol of Freyr, the god of virility, carved obscenely large, was anointed with oil and pressed into her, watched by all. She was not permitted to flinch. If she cried out, her marriage was delayed. Only silence meant purity restored. Some brides emerged laughing, emboldened by the ordeal. Others wept for days, unable to bear their husband's touch thereafter. Men often knew, but did not speak of it. It was easier to pretend ignorance than face the knowledge that their wives belonged to the gods before they ever belonged to them. There were sacrifices as well. Not of life, but of choice. Some girls were given to the temple permanently. Their families called it honor. In truth, it was often convenience. One less mouth to feed. One more blessing earned. These girls never married. Never bore children of their own. They became vessels, for prophecy, for pleasure, for punishment. They sang during rites. They restrained those who resisted. They cleaned the altars after the blood dried. Some rose to become vulvas themselves. Others faded into silence, their names remembered only in murmurs. To outsiders, these rites seem monstrous. And perhaps they were. But within that world, they were seen as necessary. Men fought with steel. Women fought with flesh. Both shed blood. Both bore scars. Both believed their suffering kept the tribe alive. Whether that belief was truth or delusion no longer mattered. Because belief, when repeated enough, becomes law. And law, when carved into flesh, becomes legacy. They believed that flesh could be renewed only when pushed to its breaking point. To the modern mind, pain is a state to be avoided, an alarm bell signaling danger. But inside a Viking pagan temple, suffering was a tool, as natural and essential as breath itself. Fire and ice were not just elements of their harsh Nordic world. They were instruments of transformation. The land they came from was a place of extremes, where summers were brief moments of golden warmth and winters could swallow entire villages in unending darkness. Everything in their culture reflected this contrast, and their rituals were no different. They did not seek comfort. They sought cleansing. They believed the body had to be shattered before the soul could be made worthy. Inside the temple, initiates were stripped of furs, jewelry, and identity. Names were sometimes taken from them, replaced with animal titles, wolf, ram, sow, stallion, depending on the role they would soon serve in ritual. To shed one's human name was to symbolically abandon civility. Only then could the true self emerge. The priests, or more accurately, gore as they were called, would circle the chosen with torches dipped in resin, the flames hissing and spitting as they moved. It wasn't enough to watch fire. Fire had to become part of the flesh. They heated bronze plates until they glowed like the eyes of mythical beasts, then pressed them against shoulders, thighs, or the small of the back. Not to maim, never to cripple. The pain was measured, controlled. It was the mark of belonging. But initiation did not always involve burning alone. Some were chosen for the trial of ice, a brutal ordeal reserved for those seeking roles of spiritual purity, temple attendants, cupbearers, or living vessels for the divine. They were led outside during the dead of winter, while the rest of the cult watched from the temple threshold. Naked, soaked in water, their hair crusting over with frost, they were made to lie upon a slab of stone while bowls of snow were piled upon their chests. To remain silent was the highest honor. If they screamed, they were deemed unready. If they passed out, the gods had rejected them. Only those who endured long enough to tremble without collapsing were lifted back into the glow of the sacred hall, where their near-frozen skin would be rubbed with animal fat and heated hands until sensation returned. Revival was as important as suffering. Death offered nothing but survival after pain. That was proof of spiritual favor. Yet even this was not the most disturbing part of the ritual. The final stage of purification involved merging pain with pleasure, ensuring that the initiate no longer viewed the two as separate forces but as one divine current. The Vikings believed that ultimate devotion meant surrendering control of one's body not only to agony but to ecstasy. They saw no contradiction in using intimate acts as pathways to transcendence. But in these temples, intimacy was not gentle. It was ritualized dominance. Those who had endured fire were often paired with those who had survived ice, the burning and the frozen brought together as living symbols of elemental union. Their bodies were painted with ash and tallow, inscribed with runes that meant rebirth, sacrifice, and resolve. They were positioned before the idols, Freya with her feline gaze, Freyr with his towering fertility symbol, and commanded to perform before the watching cult. To them, this was not humiliation. It was elevation. Priests chanted. Drumbeats thundered. The onlookers shouted invocations, demanding that the union be completed in fervor rather than shame. They believed that lust forged in pain was the purest offering, for it required the initiate to confront both weakness and desire without retreat. Some collapsed midway, unable to reconcile their trembling flesh with the expectations of the divine. Others roared like beasts, embracing the madness of the moment. Those who succeeded were crowned with garlands of pine and juniper, fragrant symbols of regrowth, and welcomed as reborn. But the ritual did not end there. After the fever of union came silence. The newly initiated were made to spend the night alone, seated beside the temple fires, not to sleep, but to reflect. They were given no blanket, no food, no comfort. Only the crackle of flame and the distant howl of wolves to accompany their thoughts. This pause between torment and acceptance was crucial. A warrior could be forged in battle, but a devotee had to forge themselves. They had to choose to stay, to resist the urge to flee, to embrace the transformation rather than resent it. Some wept. Some laughed. Some stared emotionlessly into the flames until dawn broke over their shoulders. Only then were they clothed again, not in what they once wore, but in new garments dyed in sacrificial blood. The crimson was not decoration. It was declaration. They were no longer mere humans. They were offerings that walked. To modern eyes, all of this appears grotesque, even monstrous. But to understand their world is to understand that they did not see pain as punishment. They saw it as privilege. To be chosen for fire or ice was to be recognized by the gods. To be made to scream was to be made sacred. In a land where survival itself was war, a person untested was a person unworthy. Comfort was corruption. Hardship was holiness. And perhaps that is what chills us most, not the brutality of their actions, but the sincerity of their belief. They worship gods who bled, deities who did not sit upon clouds in untouchable light, but who suffered, wandered, and starved just as men did. Odin was not a distant ruler, he was a fanatic who mutilated himself for knowledge. He plucked out his own eye and cast it into Mimir's well just to gain a sip of wisdom. He hung himself from the world tree, noose around his neck, spear in his side, not for punishment, but for revelation. For 9 nights, he dangled between life and death, refusing rescue. No priest attended him. No choir sang. He chose pain as prayer, believing agony was the purest language of devotion. This was the example that every Viking cult sought to imitate. Inside their temples, initiates were told the stories of the gods not as myths, but as commands. When they endured pain, they were not victims, they were imitators of the divine. A young novice shaking beneath the weight of ritual wounds was not seen as weak. He was seen as Odin reborn, trembling beneath the branches of Yggdrasil. A woman forced to crawl across salt-coated floors until her knees split was not pitied. She was Freya weeping for her lost lover, proving her loyalty through torment. In Viking religion, endurance was the highest form of worship. Prayer was not spoken. It was endured. The priests, or seer practitioners, would teach initiates that the gods did not bless the comfortable. They blessed the broken. They would whisper, "Only those who feel the sting of the spear can truly understand the will of the All-Father." Every ritual wound was a conversation with the divine. Every scar was a scripture. But raw pain was only half of the spiritual journey. The gods of the Norse pantheon were not solemn. They were wild, chaotic. They danced, they fought, they loved with reckless abandon. Thor would drink whole kegs of ale and laugh as the thunder cracked above him. Loki would shapeshift into mares and seduce stallions. Freyr, god of fertility, was depicted with permanent, unashamed arousal. Their mythology was as sensual as it was savage, and the temples reflected that. To worship Freyr or Freya was not to kneel in quiet reverence. It was to become like them, primal, ecstatic, unrestrained. Rituals of pleasure and suffering were often intertwined not out of cruelty, but out of imitation. When bodies were joined in wild frenzy before a wooden idol, it was not debauchery. It was reenactment. They believed that the gods themselves had performed such acts long before mortals, and humans were merely echoing divine memory. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was precision. Every ritual had hierarchy. Not all were allowed to play the role of God. Some were chosen to represent Odin, the stoic, suffering figure who must remain still even when pierced with symbolic spears. Others were cast as Freya, required to perform with grace and seduction even while weeping. Some were made to play Loki, forced to shift roles rapidly, humiliated one moment, exalted the next, embodying the trickster's unpredictability. Each role was psychologically crafted. They were not just acting, they were becoming. The priests would say that only by feeling multiple states of being, agony, arousal, shame, pride, could one understand the complexity of the gods themselves. They believed divinity was not a single emotion. It was all emotions at once. So they broke initiates open and filled them with every contradiction until they could no longer distinguish pleasure from pain, fear from excitement, devotion from madness. But what makes these rituals so haunting is not the brutality itself, it is the faith that fueled it. These were not slaves forced into torment. Most were volunteers, raised since childhood to believe that to suffer was to ascend. Farmers would leave their families and beg for acceptance into temple service. Warriors who had survived battle would return not to glory, but to ritual, claiming that victory over steel was nothing compared to victory over self. Some traveled across entire seas to reach a famed temple, only to be turned away because their eyes lacked the proper hunger. And so, they would do the unthinkable. They would wound themselves before the temple gates, slicing their forearms, cracking their knuckles against stone, gnashing their teeth until blood ran down their chins. Not in despair, but in petition. They were saying, "See, I have already begun the ritual. Do not deny me the honor of finishing it." In many cases, the priests would relent. Not out of sympathy, out of respect. There are accounts, whispered legends, of those who went too far. Of initiates so intoxicated by the idea of divine suffering that they refused to stop even when the ritual demanded it. Some would remain beneath icy water until their skin turned blue and their breath ceased. Others would continue through acts of union long past consciousness, collapsing only when their muscles gave out. They were not mourned. They were celebrated. Their names were carved not into stone, but into song. They were sung of as those who ascended without waiting for the priest to declare it. This is what sets Viking paganism apart from many ancient faiths. It was not a religion of obedience. It was a religion of imitation. Its gods were not judges, they were templates. Mortals were not meant to kneel forever. They were meant to rise to meet the divine, even if flesh had to be torn to get there. To us, this is madness. To them, it was meaning. Mercy was not a virtue in their world. It was a weakness. In lands where storms could strip flesh from bone and hunger could erase entire villages, softness was seen as a betrayal of life itself. The Vikings did not romanticize cruelty, they justified it. To them, cruelty done with purpose was not evil. It was necessary. And nowhere was this belief clearer than in their sacred initiations, where tenderness was deliberately stripped away so that only raw will remained. When an initiate hesitated during ritual, the temple did not pause. Compassion was not extended. The priests would not comfort, nor would the crowd avert their gaze. They would shout louder. They would demand more. They believed that if the soul recoiled at the threshold of transcendence, it was their duty to force it across. Mercy was not kindness. It was sabotage. Some temples even had a designated figure known as the breaker, an enforcer of spiritual discipline. This person was not chosen for size or strength, but for conviction. Their role was not simply to inflict pain. Their role was to deny escape. If someone tried to flee mid-initiation, the breaker would drag them back to the altar. If someone screamed for it to stop, the breaker would whisper in their ear, "Then die before yielding." They were not torturers. They were guardians of transformation. Their philosophy was simple. If you are capable of quitting, then you have not yet earned the right to stay human. What unsettles modern minds is not just the savagery of these rites, but the celebration that surrounded them. Young men and women who endured the worst were not seen as victims. They were paraded through villages, crowned with animal pelts, their wounds still glistening. Children reached out to touch their scars like holy relics. Elders bowed their heads in reverence. The message was clear: pain is proof of worth. But this devotion to suffering created a paradox. The more they exalted hardship, the more extreme it had to become. A ritual that once required standing barefoot on ice all night became insufficient once enough had succeeded. New trials were added. More sacred violence was invented. Some cults introduced ritual choking, where initiates would be suffocated to the brink of death, revived only when consciousness began to fade. Others included mock executions, where a blade would be pressed to the throat or chest, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to leave a memory in the flesh. Those who flinched were mocked. Those who smiled were revered. And then there were the blood feasts, where the divide between horror and holiness vanished entirely. After successful initiations, it was common to sacrifice an animal, usually a boar, goat, or stallion, not with quick slaughter, but with ritual dramatization. The initiates themselves were made to hold the creature down while the knife descended. Some temples believed that true acceptance could only be proven if the initiate tasted the blood while it was still warm. Not out of hunger, but out of unity. They believed that consuming life in its purest form allowed the spirit of the beast to fuse with their own. It was violent. It was sacred. It was applauded. To outsiders, such acts would seem barbaric. But the Vikings did not see blood as desecration. They saw it as fuel. When an initiate smeared crimson across their face, they were not defiling themselves, they were crowning themselves. For them, brutality was not monstrous. It was righteous so long as it served strength. Yet amidst all this, there were moments of eerie gentleness, not compassion, but recognition. After the frenzy, after the chants and screams and ritual acts had ended, there was always silence. The priests would walk among the initiates, not to comfort, but to assess. They would study their eyes, not the wounds, not the fatigue, but the gaze. Were they broken? Or had they transcended? A trembling hand was forgiven. A tear was unimportant. But if the eyes still burned with defiance or pride, then the ritual was considered successful. For there was one truth the Vikings valued above all: the body may bend, but the spirit must not. They did not worship flesh. They worshipped will. And so, mercy had no place because mercy interrupted will. Mercy soothed what should be sharpened. Mercy delayed ascension. Among their sayings was one that lingered through generations: better a cruel truth than a gentle lie. To them, pain was truth. Comfort was illusion. This is why even children were raised harshly, not out of malice, but out of preparation. A Viking parent would not cradle a weeping child. They would tell them, stand. A village would not shelter the weak. They would send them to the gods early. It was not seen as abandonment. It was seen as honesty. Perhaps this is why their rituals terrify us so deeply. Because beneath the blood and madness lies a philosophy that, in its own warped way, makes sense. They did not kill for joy. They did not harm without meaning. They simply refused to build a world on softness. And while we recoil at their cruelty, part of us wonders, were they really wrong to believe that strength must be earned? We live in a time where pain is avoided at all cost. They lived in a time where pain was the only proof of life. In their temples, mercy died so that devotion could live. The fires have long gone out. The temples where flesh once burned and voices once roared are buried beneath centuries of silence, moss, and snow. What remains are only ruins, shadows of timber and stone that once held the screams, chants, and cries of devotion. Yet even in their absence, the echoes linger, not in the cold walls, but in the blood memory of the human mind. We shake our heads at their rituals, labeling them savage, monstrous, unthinkable. And yet, if we peer closer, if we peel back the layers of modern comfort, we find the same impulses, the same hunger for meaning and proof, still burning quietly within us. We tell ourselves we are evolved, that we are above such acts of devotion. No one today would willingly endure fire or ice to appease unseen gods. We build hospitals, wear soft clothing, avoid pain where possible, and worship comfort as a kind of sacred law. Yet somehow, despite centuries of civilization, the desire to push beyond limits, to transform oneself through ordeal, persists. Soldiers chase pain on battlefields not because they are compelled, but because they know that survival and honor are earned, not granted. Athletes push their bodies past exhaustion, vomiting before dawn, embracing suffering as proof that they are capable, that they are more than ordinary. People endure humiliation, heartbreak, isolation, and failure in the hope that they will emerge stronger, wiser, somehow purified by the ordeal itself. We watch horror films, extreme competitions, and brutal sports, feeling fascination and dread simultaneously. There is a thrill in witnessing suffering when we are safe, a paradoxical enjoyment of fear and pain that echoes the rituals of the Vikings. Millions of people voluntarily immerse themselves in situations that test their endurance, discipline, or sanity, whether fasting, climbing mountains, running ultramarathons, or facing psychological torment. In a way, we have replaced the temple with personal trials and symbolic tests. The methods have changed, but the core impulse remains the same. Pain is still a language of transcendence. Suffering is still a path to recognition. And our obsession with endurance, with proving our capacity to bear, mirrors the very rites we now condemn. The Vikings believed that the gods themselves were made of extremes. Odin endured agony to gain wisdom, hanging from the world tree with spear inside and noose around his neck. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, experienced longing and passion in ways that blurred the line between ecstasy and torment. Thor, god of storms, drank and fought to the point of exhaustion. Loki, the trickster, embraced chaos as a form of enlightenment. The pantheon was not a set of moral exemplars but a collection of forces to be mirrored, embodied, and endured. Their mortal followers were expected to imitate these extremes, proving devotion by confronting pain, fear, and desire without flinching. They were taught that mercy was weakness, that comfort dulled the senses, and that to survive, to be worthy, one had to embrace suffering willingly. Within the temple, every act of endurance was simultaneously personal and communal. A novice who endured fire or ice was not only proving themselves to the gods but asserting their place within the community. They were demonstrating courage, resilience, and loyalty to something larger than themselves. Even failure had meaning. Those who struggled, hesitated, or wept were marked for further transformation. Their suffering was both punishment and preparation, a lesson in humility and strength. In that culture, there was no shame in pain. There was only shame in refusing it. Every scar, every tremble, every cry was a testament to the human capacity to survive and grow. Their philosophy may seem brutal to us now, but it was logical within the harsh world they inhabited, where survival required more than skill with sword or bow. It required mastery of self. And yet, even as we acknowledge this, a darker truth emerges. The Vikings' obsession with suffering, their elevation of pain to sacred status, created a paradox that modern humanity cannot easily escape. Pain became both a tool and a trap. To endure was divine, but to crave it beyond reason was madness. Some initiates became addicted to the ritual, drawn to the sensation of being tested again and again, until the line between devotion and obsession blurred. Some could no longer bear freedom, no longer experienced life outside the temple as meaningful. Their bodies were marked with scars, yes, but their minds were forever etched with the memory of what it meant to be controlled, observed, and forced to endure. And in that duality, between empowerment and entrapment, lies the most haunting lesson of all. The psychological resonance of these rites persists today. Our societies may no longer bind people to altars or force them to stand barefoot on ice, but we have invented other forms of symbolic suffering. The pressures of achievement, the cult of productivity, and the relentless pursuit of perfection are modern altars. Every late-night shift, every grueling workout, every psychological test or emotional trial is a private temple where we prove our worth to ourselves and, unconsciously, to a society that measures value in endurance. We may call it discipline, sacrifice, or ambition, but the underlying principle is identical. Survival and recognition require us to endure what many would flee. In this way, the legacy of Viking ritual lives on, not in fire and blood, but in willpower, persistence, and the sometimes painful pursuit of self-transcendence. Consider the paradox. We condemn these ancient rites as monstrous, yet we still celebrate their principles in our heroes. The warrior who endures the impossible, the artist who suffers for their craft, the athlete who pushes beyond the breaking point. These are modern analogues to the temple initiates. Pain is still a measure of worth. Endurance is still proof of devotion. And though our gods may be different, career success, personal mastery, or public acclaim, the psychological architecture remains unchanged. We may have rejected literal flames and ice, but we have retained the ritual of transformation through trial, substituting metaphorical fire for physical, social, or emotional ordeals. In many ways, the Vikings understood something we are only beginning to acknowledge. Human beings are not built for comfort. Growth requires discomfort. Understanding requires struggle. Identity is forged in the crucible of challenge. Their temples, terrifying as they were, offered a kind of brutal honesty. The only way to achieve transcendence, whether spiritual or personal, is to confront the limits of body, mind, and courage. There is a clarity in suffering that soft living cannot provide. They called it devotion. We call it perseverance. But the human craving for meaning remains unchanged. And so, long after the last torches have gone out, after the last chants have faded into legend, the essence of those rituals lingers, not in structures, not in texts, but in the human spirit. We still seek trials that will test our courage, our patience, and our endurance. We still long for moments when we can prove, to ourselves and to others, that we are capable of more than we thought. Pain continues to hold fascination because it strips away pretense, leaving only raw truth. And for all the horror we imagine in the temples of the Vikings, their fundamental lesson survives. Suffering, willingly embraced, is a path to transformation. Perhaps that is why the memory of Viking pagan rites continues to unsettle us so profoundly. Not because it is alien, but because it is uncomfortably familiar. Beneath the veneer of modern life, beneath screens, soft beds, and endless convenience, the same impulses stir within us. We seek to prove our worth. We seek to endure. We seek transformation. And while we rarely walk into flames or lie on ice for hours, we pursue trials in our own ways, through obsession, endurance, self-imposed discipline, and the silent struggles of everyday life. The temples may have crumbled. The gods may have faded into myth. The torches may have burned to ash. But the human need to confront limits, to endure suffering as proof of being, remains as real today as it was 1,000 years ago. Their legacy is not in stone or legend alone. It is in the psychological architecture they left behind. In every heart that chooses trial over comfort, in every spirit that accepts struggle as a pathway to greatness, the temple still stands. Its lessons are whispered not in chants but in the pounding of the human pulse, in the tremor of fear met with courage, in the quiet affirmation of survival and transformation. Perhaps, in the end, the gods were never watching. Perhaps the trials were never meant for the divine at all. Perhaps the flames, the ice, the pain, the endurance, all of it, was a mirror, reflecting back to each human soul the capacity for strength, resilience, and rebirth. And perhaps the true lesson is this: do not ask for mercy. Do not seek comfort. Do not shrink from trial. Ask instead to be transformed. Ask instead to endure. Ask to become something greater than the sum of your fear and flesh. For in the shadows of the temples, in the stories of agony and devotion, the Vikings left us a truth as sharp as a blade and as enduring as fire. Transformation demands courage, and courage is forged in suffering.